I still remember the weight of that old brass key in my palm, how it felt both impossibly heavy and completely weightless at the same time. I was standing in the administrative office of Riverside Children's Home on a cold February morning, 3 days after my 21st birthday, with everything I owned stuffed into a single duffel bag at my feet. Mrs. Henderson, the director who had watched over me since I was 7 years old, stood across the desk with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. In her trembling hands, she held an envelope that had been sealed for over a decade, waiting for this exact moment. My name is Charlotte Bennett, and this is the story of how I went from having absolutely nothing to discovering I had inherited something far more valuable than I could have ever imagined. But I need to start at the beginning, because the journey to that ranch, to understanding what it truly meant, required me to walk through some of the darkest valleys of my childhood first. Some stories cannot be rushed, and mine is woven with threads of loss, loneliness, hope, and ultimately a love that transcended death itself. I arrived at Riverside Children's Home when I was 7 years old, on a rainy October evening that felt like the world was weeping alongside me. My parents had died in a car accident 3 weeks earlier, their vehicle hydroplaning on a slick highway during a storm. One moment I had a family, a home, a bedroom painted lavender with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. The next moment, I was an orphan, a word that felt sharp and jagged in my mouth whenever I tried to say it out loud. I had no siblings, no aunts or uncles willing to take me in, no grandparents that anyone could locate. Or so I believed for 14 long years. The children's home was located in a small town called Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Tennessee. It was an old Victorian building that had been converted decades earlier, with creaking floorboards, drafty windows, and radiators that clanged and hissed through the night. But despite its aged appearance, Riverside was filled with warmth. Mrs. Henderson ran it with a firm but loving hand, and the staff genuinely cared about the children who cycled through those doors. Some kids stayed for months, others for years. I became one of the lifers, one of the ones who grew up within those walls, celebrating birthdays and holidays with a rotating cast of temporary siblings. Growing up in an orphanage teaches you things that other children never have to learn. You learn how to make yourself small, how to not take up too much space or need too much attention. You learn that attachments are dangerous because people leave whether they want to or not. You learn to find joy in the smallest things: an extra cookie at dinner, a sunny afternoon in the backyard, a library book that transports you somewhere far away from the reality of your situation. Most importantly, you learn that family is not always about blood. Sometimes family is the girl in the bed next to yours who holds your hand during thunderstorms, because she knows storms remind you of the night your parents died. Sometimes family is the cook who sneaks you into the kitchen on your birthday to let you lick the frosting bowl. Sometimes family is the director who stays up late helping you with homework, even though she has a mountain of paperwork waiting on her desk. I was never adopted, though there were close calls over the years. When I was 9, a couple came to visit several times, and I allowed myself to dream about having a mother and father again. But they ultimately chose a younger child, a little boy with dimples and an infectious laugh. When I was 12, a single woman seemed interested, but the adoption fell through for reasons I was never told. After that, I stopped hoping. I focused on school instead, pouring all my energy into academics because education felt like the one thing that could never be taken away from me. I maintained straight A's throughout middle school and high school, driven by the knowledge that a scholarship was my only path to a future beyond these walls. The other children came and went like seasons. I watched younger kids get placed with families and felt genuine happiness for them, even as something inside me withered a little more each time. I formed friendships that lasted months or years before someone moved to a foster home or aged out of the system. By the time I was 17, I was one of the oldest residents at Riverside, and I had already begun preparing myself mentally for what came next. At 18, I would graduate high school. At 21, I would have to leave the children's home permanently. I had no illusions about what that meant. I would be on my own, completely and utterly alone in the world, with no safety net and no one to call if things went wrong. Mrs. Henderson tried to help me plan for independence. She connected me with social services programs, helped me apply for college scholarships, and encouraged me to save every penny I earned from my part-time job at the local library. I did manage to get a partial scholarship to a community college 2 towns over, and I worked 20 hours a week shelving books and helping patrons find what they needed. It wasn't much, but it was something. I told myself that something was enough, that I would build a life from these small somethings until I had created a foundation solid enough to stand on. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that I was not as alone as I believed. Somewhere out there I had family. I had a grandfather I had never met, a man who had been estranged from my mother for reasons I didn't understand, and he had been looking for me. The envelope Mrs. Henderson held that February morning had arrived at Riverside 13 years earlier, just a few months after I was placed there. Inside was a letter from a lawyer representing my grandfather, Gerald Morrison, along with specific instructions that were to be followed to the letter. The envelope was not to be opened until I turned 21 or aged out of the system, whichever came first. It was to be kept in a safe place, and upon the designated date I was to be given its contents along with a key that had been entrusted to Mrs. Henderson's care. She had kept this secret for over a decade, watching me grow from a grieving 7-year-old into a determined young woman, all while knowing that my entire understanding of my situation was incomplete. I cannot imagine how many times she must have wanted to tell me, to ease the loneliness I felt, believing I had no one in the world. But she had made a promise to my grandfather, and Mrs. Henderson was a woman who kept her promises, no matter how difficult they became to bear. When she finally handed me that envelope, her voice was thick with emotion. "Charlotte, sweetheart, there's something you need to know, something I've been holding on to for a very long time." Her hands shook as she passed the yellowed envelope across the desk. "Your grandfather, he never stopped looking for you after your parents died. By the time he found you, you were already here, already settling in, and he made a choice I didn't fully understand at the time, but one I've come to see was made out of love." I took the envelope with trembling fingers, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind used for important documents. My name was written across the front in elegant script, Charlotte Rose Bennett, to be opened on her 21st birthday. I looked up at Mrs. Henderson, questions flooding my mind faster than I could form them into words. She simply nodded, encouraging me to open it, and placed the brass key on the desk between us. The letter inside was written in a shaky hand, the handwriting of someone elderly or ill, and it began with words that made my vision blur with tears. "My dearest Charlotte, I am writing this letter knowing I will never have the chance to say these words to you in person, and that breaks my heart in ways I cannot fully express. Can I continue to Block 2? Sim 18, 35 Block 2. The letter continued, and with each sentence I felt the ground shifting beneath me, my understanding of my own history rearranging itself into something completely different than what I had believed for 14 years. My name is Gerald Morrison, and I am your mother's father, which makes me your grandfather. I know this must come as a shock to you, reading these words from a stranger who shares your blood. I wish circumstances were different. I wish I could be there to watch you grow, to know the young woman you will become. But my health is failing rapidly, and the doctors have given me only months to live. So instead, I write this letter, and I make arrangements that I hope will give you something I failed to give your mother: a foundation, a home, and a chance to build the life you deserve. My hands were shaking so badly that Mrs. Henderson gently took the letter from me and continued reading aloud, her voice steady, even as tears rolled down her cheeks. The letter went on to explain that my grandfather and my mother had been estranged for nearly a decade before her death. It was a rift born from stubbornness on both sides, the kind of family fracture that seems impossible to bridge, until suddenly it is too late, and the opportunity is gone forever. My mother had married my father against my grandfather's wishes. He had disapproved of the match, believing my father was not stable enough, not established enough, to provide the kind of life his daughter deserved. Words were exchanged, harsh and unforgivable in the moment. My mother had walked away from the family ranch, from her inheritance, from her father, and she had never looked back. For years they did not speak. Pride and hurt feelings built a wall between them that grew taller with each passing season. My grandfather had wanted to reach out, had picked up the phone 1,000 times, but always found a reason to wait, to give it more time, to let the wounds heal a little longer. And then came the news of the accident, delivered by a state trooper on a morning much like the one I was experiencing now, cold and grey and fundamentally life-altering. He had lost his daughter without ever having the chance to tell her he was sorry, that his love for her had never wavered even through the silence. When he learned about me, about a granddaughter he had never met, he immediately tried to gain custody. But by then, his health was already deteriorating. He had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and the prognosis was grim. The courts would not place a child with someone who was terminally ill and had no other family to ensure continuity of care. He fought anyway, hiring lawyers and filing petitions. But the system moved slowly, and his body was failing faster than the legal process could accommodate. Faced with the reality that he would not live to see me placed in his care, he made a different choice. I could not be your grandfather in life, the letter read, but perhaps I can be something to you in death. I own a ranch in Montana, 300 acres of land that has been in our family for 4 generations. It is called Sage Creek Ranch, and it was your mother's favorite place in the world when she was growing up. She learned to ride horses there, spent summers helping with the cattle, and always said that the big sky country made her feel like anything was possible. I'm leaving this ranch to you, Charlotte, not to be sold immediately for quick cash, though that is certainly your right if you choose. But I am leaving it to you with the hope that you might go there, might see what your mother loved, and might find in that land something that connects you to the family you never got to know. The letter explained that the ranch had been placed in a trust, managed by a law firm in Helena, Montana, until I turned 21. A caretaker had been hired to maintain the property, to ensure that the house did not fall into complete disrepair and that the land was properly managed. There were funds set aside for property taxes and basic maintenance, enough to keep things running for 2 decades if necessary. Everything had been planned meticulously, down to the smallest detail, by a dying man who wanted to give his only grandchild something permanent, something real, something that could not be taken away by circumstance or tragedy. The key that Mrs. Henderson will give you opens the front door of the ranch house. The letter continued. Inside, you will find more letters, photographs and stories about your mother's childhood. You will find her bedroom, preserved exactly as she left it when she moved away. You will find the life she walked away from, and perhaps, in understanding her story, you will better understand your own. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, Charlotte. I was not there when you needed family most. But if you can find it in your heart, please go to Sage Creek Ranch. Please see what I am trying to give you. And please know that even though we never met, I have loved you from the moment I learned of your existence. The letter was signed simply, Your grandfather, Gerald Morrison, followed by a date from 13 years ago. He had died 2 weeks after writing it, never knowing if his plans would reach me, never knowing if I would accept this impossible gift or reject it as too little, too late. I sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Henderson placed the brass key in my hand, closing my fingers around it gently. He wanted you to have choices, Charlotte. He wanted you to have something solid to stand on when you left here. I think he understood that growing up in this place, no matter how much love we tried to give you, would leave you feeling unanchored. The ranch is yours, free and clear, no strings attached except his hope that you might go see it. The practical questions started flooding in then, pushing past the emotional overwhelm. But I have nothing, I whispered. No money for the trip to Montana. No way to maintain a ranch, even if I could get there. I don't know anything about ranching or livestock or any of it. How am I supposed to just show up and take over a 300-acre property, Mrs. Henderson smiled through her tears and produced another envelope. This one more modern, with the letterhead of Morrison and Associates, attorneys at law. Your grandfather thought of that too. There is a fund, not a fortune, but enough to get you started. Enough for travel expenses, enough to cover your living costs for the first 6 months while you figure things out. The caretaker, a man named Robert Fletcher, has been expecting this day. He has instructions to help you transition into ownership, to teach you what you need to know, and to continue working for you if you choose to keep him on. Everything has been arranged, Charlotte. All you have to do is decide if you are brave enough to claim it. Brave enough. Those words echoed in my mind as I walked out of that office and into the cold February morning, the key burning a hole in my pocket and my mind reeling with possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. I had spent 14 years preparing myself to face the world alone, to build a life from nothing with only my determination and work ethic to rely on. And now, suddenly, I had been handed an inheritance, a connection to family I never knew existed, and a choice that felt impossibly large. I spent the next week in a fog, going through the motions of my final days at Riverside, while my mind was already thousands of miles away, trying to imagine what Sage Creek Ranch looked like, what my mother's childhood bedroom contained, what kind of man my grandfather had been. I researched Montana obsessively, reading about the climate, the culture, the economy. I looked up Sage Creek Ranch on satellite maps, zooming in on the property lines and trying to make out details of buildings and landscape. I read everything I could find about ranching, about cattle and horses and land management, trying to educate myself on a world I knew absolutely nothing about. The other part of me, the practical part that had been honed by years of uncertainty, kept whispering warnings. What if this was a mistake? What if I went all the way to Montana, only to find that the ranch was unsalvageable, that the caretaker had been stealing from the trust, that the whole thing was too overwhelming for someone with no experience? What if I failed? What if I took this leap and fell flat on my face with no safety net to catch me? But then I would feel the weight of that key in my pocket, and I would remember the words my grandfather had written. Perhaps I can be something to you in death. He had given me a gift, not just of property, but of possibility. And deep down, beneath all the fear and uncertainty, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt curious. I felt hopeful. I felt like maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something extraordinary. So here's what I want you to do if you're listening to this story and it is resonating with you in any way. Hit that subscribe button, because I need you to come along on this journey with me. I need you to be there as I figure out what it means to inherit a ranch I've never seen, to connect with a family history I never knew existed, to become someone I never imagined I could be. And I want to hear from you. Have you ever been given an unexpected opportunity that terrified and excited you in equal measure? Have you ever had to choose between staying in the safe, known world and leaping into something completely uncertain? Drop a comment and let me know, because I am about to make the biggest decision of my life, and I could use all the wisdom and encouragement this community can offer. Can I continue to Block 3? Sim 18, 36 Block 3. 2 weeks later, I was on a Greyhound bus headed west, watching the landscape change outside my window as Tennessee gave way to Arkansas, then Oklahoma, then Kansas, and finally Montana. The journey took 3 days, with stops in small towns whose names I immediately forgot, and rest areas where I ate vending machine snacks because it was cheaper than restaurant food. I had packed everything I owned into 2 bags, the same duffel I had been carrying since childhood, and a backpack I had bought at a thrift store for $5. In my pocket, I carried the brass key, the letter from my grandfather, and a cashier's check from the trust fund that represented more money than I had ever possessed in my life. Mrs. Henderson had helped me coordinate everything before I left. She had contacted Robert Fletcher, the caretaker, to let him know I was coming. She had helped me purchase the bus ticket and put together a budget for my first few months in Montana. She had even given me a prepaid cell phone, one of those basic models that could make calls and send texts, but not much else. So I would have a way to reach out if I needed help. On my last morning at Riverside, she had hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, and whispered in my ear, "You are going to do amazing things, Charlotte Bennett. I've always known it, and now you are going to prove it to yourself." The closer I got to Montana, the more nervous I became. The land out here was so different from anything I had ever experienced. The skies seemed impossibly vast, stretching from horizon to horizon without interruption, and the mountains in the distance looked like something from a painting rather than reality. Everything felt bigger here, more open, more raw. I could understand why my mother had loved it, why she had called it Big Sky Country. There was something about the landscape that made you feel simultaneously insignificant and empowered, like you were just a small part of something much larger, but that your small part still mattered. Robert Fletcher met me at the bus station in Helena, a town of about 32,000 people that would be the nearest major hub to the ranch. He was in his early 60s, tall and weathered, with the kind of deep tan that comes from spending every day outdoors, and the kind of quiet competence that immediately put me at ease. He shook my hand firmly, took one of my bags without asking, and led me to a dusty pickup truck that looked like it had been around since before I was born, but ran like it would last another 50 years. "You look like your mother," he said as we pulled out of the parking lot, his voice gruff but not unkind. Gerald showed me pictures. "You have her eyes, same color, kind of greenish-grey, like the sagebrush after rain." It was the first time anyone had ever told me I looked like my mother. I had no photographs of her, no mementos, nothing except fragmented memories that felt more like dreams than reality. Hearing that I carried some visible piece of her in my face made my throat tighten with emotion. The drive from Helena to Sage Creek Ranch took nearly 2 hours, heading north and east into increasingly rural territory. Robert filled the silence with practical information about the property, speaking in the efficient manner of someone who had spent years managing the land and wanted me to understand what I was inheriting. The ranch was 315 acres, he explained, with about 200 acres of grazing land, 50 acres of hayfields, and the rest consisting of the main compound, wooded areas, and a creek that ran through the property year-round, hence the name Sage Creek. The ranch currently ran about 70 head of cattle, mostly Angus, which was a breed known for being hardy and well suited to Montana's climate. There were also 4 horses, 2 for working the cattle, and 2 that had been your mother's personal mounts, now elderly but still healthy. The main house was a 2-story log structure built in the 1940s by my great-grandfather, solid and well-maintained. There was also a barn, a stable, a machine shed, and several smaller outbuildings for storage and equipment. Robert had been managing the ranch for 13 years, ever since my grandfather's death. He had a small cabin on the property where he lived, and he had run Sage Creek as efficiently as possible with limited resources, selling cattle each fall to generate income that went back into the trust fund to cover expenses. He had done some haying, maintained the fencing, and kept the buildings in good repair, but he was honest about the limitations. "This place could be so much more," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "With proper investment, with someone willing to put in the work and grow the operation, Sage Creek could thrive. But I was just the caretaker, keeping things alive until you were ready to claim them. What happens next is entirely up to you." When we finally turned off the main highway onto a gravel road marked by a weathered wooden sign that read Sage Creek Ranch, Morrison Family, Est 1947, my heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. The road wound through open grassland dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers, past fence lines that seemed to stretch forever, until finally the main compound came into view over a small rise. The house was beautiful in a rustic, unpretentious way. It was built from massive logs that had darkened with age to a rich honey brown, with a wide front porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a stone chimney rising from the centre. The windows were large and welcoming, and I could see lace curtains moving slightly in the breeze from one that had been left open. Flower boxes under the windows held dirt, but no flowers, evidence of years without a woman's touch. The barn was painted dark red, weathered but sturdy, and I could see horses grazing in a nearby pasture, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. Robert pulled the truck up to the front of the house and killed the engine. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Your grandfather left this with me to give to you when you arrived. Said it was important that you read it before you went inside." He handed me the envelope, then climbed out of the truck, giving me privacy for whatever message waited inside. This letter was shorter than the first, written in the same shaky handwriting, but with an urgency that made the words feel almost alive on the page. "Charlotte, if you are reading this, then you have chosen to come to Sage Creek, and I am more grateful for that than you can possibly know. Before you enter this house, I need you to understand something. I have preserved your mother's room exactly as she left it, and in doing so, I have also preserved my own grief and regret. What you will find inside is not a museum or a shrine, but a snapshot of a life interrupted, of a relationship broken that should have been mended. I share this with you not to burden you with my mistakes, but to teach you something I learned too late. Pride is a poison that kills slowly. Stubbornness is a wall that keeps out love as effectively as it keeps out pain. Do not make the mistakes I made, Charlotte. Do not let the people you love slip away because you are too proud to bend, too stubborn to forgive. Life is shorter than you think, and the time for reconciliation is always now, never later. Walk into this house knowing that you are home, that you are loved, and that you have a chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of what was lost. Make me proud, granddaughter. Make your mother proud. But most importantly, make yourself proud. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my pocket next to the key. Then I climbed out of the truck, my legs shaky from the long journey and the weight of the moment. Robert stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands, waiting to see what I would do. I walked up the porch steps, each board creaking under my feet, and stopped in front of the heavy wooden door. The brass key slid into the lock as if it had been waiting for this exact moment, and when I turned it, I heard the mechanism click open with a sound that felt like permission, like welcome, like coming home to a place I had never been. The inside of the house was dim and cool, protected from the afternoon heat by thick log walls and drawn curtains. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a large living room with a stone fireplace, comfortable-looking furniture covered in protective sheets, and walls lined with bookshelves and family photographs. The air smelled like wood smoke and dust, and something faintly floral that might have been my grandmother's perfume, lingering all these years later. Everything was clean but still, like a house that had been waiting patiently for someone to bring it back to life. Robert came in behind me and began opening curtains, letting light flood into the space. As the room brightened, I could see more details. The photographs on the walls showed people I had never met, but who shared my features, my nose, my jawline, my hair color. There were pictures of a young woman who had to be my mother, sitting on a horse with a huge grin on her face, standing in front of the barn, with her arms around a man who must have been my grandfather, holding a blue ribbon at what looked like a county fair. She looked happy in these pictures, genuinely joyful in a way I had never seen in the few formal photographs that existed from her adult life. Her room is upstairs, Robert said quietly. Second door, on the right. I haven't been in there since your grandfather died. Felt like that was for you to discover. He paused, then added, I will be in the barn if you need me. Take your time. This is a lot to process. I climbed the stairs slowly, running my hand along the smooth wooden banister, trying to imagine my mother as a child running up and down these same steps. The hallway at the top was lined with more photographs, a visual history of the Morrison family spanning generations. And then I was standing in front of the second door on the right, my hand on the knob, my heart in my throat. When I opened the door, I stepped into a time capsule. The room was frozen in what must have been the late 1990s, based on the posters on the walls and the style of the bedspread. There was a twin bed with a patchwork quilt, a desk with school papers still scattered across it, a bookshelf overflowing with young adult novels and horse magazines. Ribbons from competitions hung on one wall, blue and red and white, evidence of a girl who had been good at something she loved. On the dresser sat a jewelry box, and next to it a framed photograph of a young couple I recognized from other pictures downstairs, my mother and father, looking impossibly young and completely in love. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and something inside me that had been tightly wound for 14 years finally released. I cried for the mother I barely remembered, for the grandfather I never met, for the family that should have been mine, but was stolen by pride and stubbornness and terrible timing. I cried for the little girl I had been, alone and scared in a children's home, not knowing that somewhere out here, A dying man was trying desperately to give her a foundation to build her life on, and I cried with relief, because for the first time since I was 7 years old, I was not standing on uncertain ground. I was home. Can I continue to Block 4? Sim 1838 Block 4. The first few weeks at Sage Creek Ranch were a whirlwind of discovery, learning and adjustment that left me exhausted every night, but more alive than I had felt in years. Robert Fletcher became my teacher, my guide, and eventually something like the family I had always needed. He was patient with my ignorance, never making me feel stupid for not knowing the difference between a heifer and a steer, or for being terrified the first time I had to climb onto one of the horses. He understood that I was not just learning how to run a ranch, I was learning how to inhabit a completely different kind of life, one where my value was not measured by test scores or the approval of authority figures, but by whether I could mend a fence line, deliver a calf, or read the weather well enough to know when to bring the herd in from the high pasture. Every morning, I woke before dawn to the sound of Robert's truck pulling up to the main house. He would knock once, then let himself in to start coffee while I stumbled downstairs, still groggy, but determined not to miss a single lesson. We would sit at the kitchen table, that same table where my mother had eaten breakfast as a child, and Robert would outline the day's work over strong black coffee and whatever simple breakfast I had managed to put together. Then we would head out into the Montana morning, where the air was so crisp and clean it almost hurt to breathe, and the sun rose over the mountains in shades of pink and gold that made me understand why artists had been trying to capture this light for centuries. Robert taught me how to check the cattle, moving among them on horseback, to look for signs of illness or injury, to count heads and make sure none had wandered off or gotten tangled in fencing. He taught me how to properly feed the horses, how to clean their hooves and check their teeth, how to saddle them correctly so the weight was distributed evenly and they would not develop sores. He showed me how to operate the tractor, how to stack hay bales, how to maintain the irrigation system that kept the hay fields productive through the dry Montana summers. Every single day brought new challenges, new skills to master, new ways that my body reminded me I had spent 21 years doing absolutely nothing this physically demanding, but the physical work was only part of what I was learning. Robert also taught me about the history of Sage Creek Ranch, filling in details that the letters and photographs could not convey. He told me about my great-grandfather, Thomas Morrison, who had started the ranch in 1947 after returning from World War II with a dream of building something permanent, something that could be passed down through generations. He told me about my grandfather Gerald, who had taken over the ranch in the 1970s and expanded it from a small operation to the 300-acre property it was now. And he told me about my mother, Sarah, who had been the kind of girl who could outride and outwork anyone on the ranch, who had dreams bigger than Montana could contain, and who had broken her father's heart when she chose a different path. "Your grandfather was a hard man in some ways," Robert said one evening as we sat on the porch after a long day of fixing fence posts. He had strong opinions about how things should be done, and he did not bend easily when he thought he was right. But he loved your mother more than anything in this world. When she left, when she married your father and cut ties, it broke something in him. He threw himself into the ranch, worked himself nearly to death, trying to fill the hole she left. And then, when he got sick, when he realized he was dying without ever having made things right with her, it destroyed what was left. I listened to these stories with a mixture of sadness and fascination, trying to piece together an understanding of the people who had shaped my existence, even though I never knew them. I spent hours in my mother's room, reading through her old journals and school papers, looking at the photographs she had kept in shoeboxes under her bed. I found love letters from my father, written when they were teenagers, full of the kind of earnest, unguarded emotion that only young love can inspire. I found drawings she had made of the ranch, detailed sketches that showed how carefully she had observed every building, every animal, every corner of the property. And I found a letter she had started writing to her father, but never finished, dated just a few months before the accident, beginning with the words, "Dad, I think it is time we talked. I have been stubborn, and so have you, but I miss you, and I want my daughter to know her grandfather." She had been planning to reach out. She had been ready to bridge that gap, to heal that wound. But she had waited just a little too long, and then time ran out for both of them. The tragedy of it sat heavy on my chest, a reminder of my grandfather's final lesson about pride and stubbornness, and the danger of believing you always have more time than you actually do. As the weeks turned into months, I began to find my rhythm at Sage Creek. I learned to read the cattle, to recognize individual animals by their markings and personalities. I learned to anticipate the weather by watching the clouds and feeling the wind, skills that Robert had developed over decades and was generous enough to share. I learned to fix equipment when it broke, to improvise solutions with baling wire and ingenuity, to accept that ranching was a constant cycle of maintenance and repair, and making do with what you had. Most importantly, I learned that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for, both physically and emotionally. But running a ranch was expensive, and the trust fund my grandfather had left, while generous, was not infinite. I spent long evenings going over the ranch's finances, trying to understand the income from cattle sales versus the expenses of feed, veterinary care, equipment maintenance, and property taxes. Robert had done an admirable job of keeping things afloat on a minimal budget. But if I wanted Sage Creek to be more than just a hobby ranch, if I wanted it to actually thrive and support me long term, I needed to make some changes and investments. I started researching different approaches to ranching, reading everything I could find about sustainable agriculture, grass-fed beef operations, and value-added agricultural products. I reached out to the local extension office and attended workshops on business planning for small ranchers. I met with other ranchers in the area, many of whom remembered my grandfather and were curious about the granddaughter who had suddenly appeared to claim his legacy. Some were welcoming and generous with advice. Others were skeptical, clearly doubting that a 21-year-old girl with no ranching background could make a success of Sage Creek. I encountered my first major crisis in late June when one of our pregnant cows went into distress during calving. Robert and I had been checking the herd multiple times a day as she approached her due date, but she went into labor in the middle of the night, and by the time I heard her distressed lowing and rushed out to the pasture, she was in serious trouble. The calf was breech, positioned wrong, and without intervention, both cow and calf would die. Robert was out of town for the first time since I had arrived, attending his daughter's wedding in Billings, 3 hours away. I had insisted he go, that I could handle things for a few days, and now I was alone with a labouring cow and absolutely no idea what to do. My hands were shaking as I called the local veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Patricia Martinez, who had been treating Sage Creek's animals for 20 years. She talked me through the situation over the phone, her voice calm and professional, and then delivered news that made my stomach drop. She was dealing with an emergency 30 miles in the opposite direction and could not get to me for at least 2 hours. If I wanted to save the cow and calf, I would have to assist with the birth myself. I will spare you the graphic details, but I will tell you this. assisting with a breech birth, shoulder deep in a labouring cow, following Dr. Martinez's instructions over a phone balanced precariously on a fence post was the most terrifying and empowering thing I had ever done. I could feel the calf's legs tangled wrong, could feel the mother's body straining and exhausted, could feel my own fear threatening to paralyze me. But I kept working, kept trying, kept pushing past my disgust and terror, because 2 lives depended on me not giving up. When that calf finally slid free, slick and perfect and alive, and when the mother cow immediately began cleaning him with her rough tongue, I sat back in the dirt and the blood and the afterbirth and cried with relief and joy and amazement that I had actually done it. Dr. Martinez stayed on the phone with me until she was sure both cow and calf were stable, and her final words before hanging up were, "You are a rancher now, Charlotte. That is your initiation right there. Everything else is just details." Robert returned 2 days later and found me in the pasture, sitting on the fence and watching the calf I had delivered nurse from his mother. When I told him what had happened, he did not seem surprised. He just nodded, as if he had expected all along that I would rise to the challenge when it mattered. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said simply. "Your mother, too. They were both the kind of people who did what needed to be done, even when it scared them." By the time summer faded into fall, I had made some decisions about the ranch's future. I was going to transition to grass-fed, pasture-raised beef, marketing directly to consumers who cared about sustainable agriculture and humane animal treatment. I was going to start small, building relationships with restaurants and farmers' markets in Helena and Bozeman, cities where there was a growing demand for locally sourced, high-quality meat. I was going to invest in better fencing and pasture management, techniques that would improve the land's health while reducing costs. And I was going to do it all while honoring the legacy my grandfather had left me, maintaining Sage Creek as a family ranch that valued stewardship over extraction, quality over quantity. The first cattle sale that fall was terrifying. I had spent weeks preparing, working with Robert to select the best animals, arranging transportation, and marketing our beef to potential buyers. I had created a simple website, something I knew how to do from my library job, showcasing Sage Creek Ranch and our commitment to sustainable practices. I had visited restaurants personally, offering samples and explaining our approach. And when the orders started coming in, when I realized that people were willing to pay a premium for what we were producing, I felt something shift inside me. I was not just surviving anymore. I was building something. I was creating a future that was entirely my own, rooted in a past I never knew, but connected to it in ways that felt profound and right. I was honoring my grandfather's gift, not just by accepting it, but by making it grow, by proving that his faith in me was justified. Now, can I continue to Block 5? Sim 18, 39 Block 5. As winter descended on Sage Creek Ranch, bringing with it the kind of cold that freezes your breath in your lungs and turns the world into a monochrome landscape of white snow and grey sky, I experienced my first full cycle of seasons on the land. The work changed but never stopped. Where summer had been about pasture management and haying and preparing for calving season, winter was about feeding cattle twice a day, breaking ice on water troughs, and maintaining equipment in temperatures that made metal burn your skin if you touched it with bare hands. Robert taught me how to layer clothing properly, how to recognize the signs of frostbite, and how to keep the ancient tractor running even when the engine didn't want to turn over in sub-zero temperatures. But winter also brought a different kind of gift, the gift of time. With the cattle moved to pastures closer to the barn, and the land sleeping under its blanket of snow, the frantic pace of summer slowed to something more contemplative. I spent long evenings in the ranch house, feeding the fireplace and reading through boxes of family papers I had found in the attic. I discovered my great-grandmother's recipes, handwritten on index cards yellowed with age, for things like huckleberry pie and elk roast, and sourdough biscuits made with starter that had been kept alive for generations. I found my grandfather's journals, years of entries documenting weather patterns, cattle prices, calving records, and occasional personal reflections that gave me glimpses into his inner life. In one entry from 15 years before his death, shortly after my mother had left, he had written, "Sarah called today to tell me she is getting married. She did not ask for my blessing, and I did not offer it. We argued again, said things that cannot be unsaid. After I hung up the phone, I walked out to the high pasture and stood there until dark, watching the sun set behind the mountains and wondering how I became the kind of man who would let pride cost him his daughter. Tomorrow I will call her and apologize. Tomorrow I will try to build a bridge. But tomorrow never seems to come, and the days keep passing, and the distance between us grows wider." He had never made that call. Tomorrow had stretched into months, then years, then forever. Reading his words, feeling his regret so palpably on the page, I understood even more deeply what he had been trying to teach me in his final letter. Life does not wait for us to be ready. The people we love will not always be there for us to make amends to later. The time to reach out, to forgive, to love openly and without reservation is always now. It made me think about my own life, about the friendships I had let drift away when people left the children's home, about the walls I had built to protect myself from attachment and loss. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, who I had only called twice since leaving Tennessee, brief conversations to report that I was alive and managing. I realized that I had been so focused on proving I could handle independence that I had forgotten to maintain the connections that mattered, the people who had been my family when I had no blood relatives to claim me. That night, I wrote letters. Long handwritten letters to Mrs. Henderson, to the social worker who had helped me navigate the system, to a few of the kids I had grown up with at Riverside, who I had managed to stay in touch with through social media. I told them about Sage Creek, about learning to ranch, about discovering a family history I never knew existed. I thanked them for the role they had played in making me who I was, for being the family I needed when I needed it most. And I promised to do better, to not let distance or busyness or the fear of vulnerability keep me from staying connected to the people who mattered. Spring came slowly to Montana, teasing with warm days in March that were inevitably followed by late-season snowstorms that reminded everyone that winter was not done yet. But gradually, the snow melted, the creek swelled with runoff, and the land began to green up in a way that made my heart ache with its beauty. This was calving season, the busiest and most critical time of year, when months of careful management would either pay off or fall apart, depending on how well we had prepared. Robert and I worked around the clock, checking the pregnant cows every few hours, watching for signs of labor, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. After my experience with the breech birth in June, I was less terrified and more confident, though each birth still came with its own unique challenges and anxieties. We lost one calf to complications I could not prevent, and I cried over its small, perfect body, while Robert quietly handled the burial and comforted the grieving mother cow. But we also welcomed 37 healthy calves into the world, each one a small miracle, each one representing the continuation of the ranch and the promise of future income. By the time spring fully established itself, I had been at Sage Creek Ranch for 14 months. I was no longer the uncertain young woman who had stepped off a bus in Helena with everything she owned in 2 bags and terror in her heart. I had muscles I had never had before, calluses on my hands that would probably never fully go away, and a deep tan from spending every day outside under the Montana sun. I knew the land intimately now, could recognize individual cattle by sight, could predict with reasonable accuracy where the herd would graze based on the weather and the season. I had built relationships with other ranchers, with buyers, with the veterinarian and the feed store owner, and the mechanic who kept our equipment running. I belonged here in a way I had never belonged anywhere else. But belonging came with its own challenges. In May, Robert sat me down for a serious conversation about his future. His daughter had been asking him to move to Billings, to be closer to her and her growing family, to finally retire after decades of hard physical labor. He was 63 years old, and the work was getting harder every year. He wanted to know if I was ready to hire someone else, or if I was confident enough to run the ranch mostly on my own, with seasonal help during the busiest times. The thought of losing Robert terrified me. He had been my teacher, my safety net, my connection to my grandfather and to the ranch's history. But I also understood that I could not ask him to put his life on hold for me indefinitely. He had fulfilled his obligation to my grandfather many times over. He had given me a foundation to build on. What I did with that foundation was now entirely up to me. "I think you are ready," Robert said when I expressed my fears. "You have learned faster than anyone I have ever worked with, and you have the heart for this work. That matters more than experience. You will make mistakes, everyone does, but you will learn from them and keep going. That is what ranchers do. That is what Morrisons do." We agreed that he would stay through the summer to help me hire and train someone new, and then he would move to Billings in the fall. It gave me a few months to prepare, to find the right person, and to prove to myself that I could actually do this without him. The uncertainty was uncomfortable, but it was also exhilarating in a way I had not expected. I was truly becoming the owner of Sage Creek Ranch, not just the inheritor, but the person responsible for its future. Through the summer, I interviewed several candidates for the ranch hand position, and eventually hired a woman named Maria Gonzalez, 34 years old, who had grown up on a ranch in New Mexico and was looking for a fresh start after a difficult divorce. She was experienced, hard-working, and shared my vision for sustainable ranching practices. More than that, she understood what it meant to be rebuilding your life from scratch, to be creating something new from the pieces of what had broken. We connected immediately, and Robert approved of my choice, which gave me confidence that I had made the right decision. As fall approached and Robert prepared to leave, we had one final project to complete together. There was a section of the ranch, about 20 acres of rough terrain along the creek, that had never been fully utilized because the fencing was inadequate and the land was difficult to access. Robert and I spent 2 weeks working on it, clearing brush, building new fence, and creating a path that would allow us to use the land for rotational grazing. It was hard, satisfying work, the kind of project that transforms a landscape and requires you to envision what could be rather than what is. On Robert's last day at Sage Creek Ranch, we stood together at the edge of that newly cleared land, looking out over the creek and the mountains beyond. "Your grandfather would be amazed," Robert said quietly. "Not just that you came, but that you stayed, that you made this place your own, that you are building something here that honors the past while creating a future." He turned to look at me, his weathered face soft, with something that looked like fatherly pride. "You are a rancher, Charlotte Morrison Bennett, not because you inherited the land, but because you earned the right to call yourself one. Do not ever forget that." After Robert left, the ranch felt emptier, but also somehow more mine. Maria was a capable partner, but she had her own cabin and her own life, and the main house belonged entirely to me now. I spent the quiet winter evenings planning for the future, expanding our direct-to-consumer sales, building relationships with more restaurants, and researching ways to diversify the ranch's income through agritourism or value-added products. I was determined not just to maintain what my grandfather had built, but to grow it into something sustainable for generations to come. On my 23rd birthday, 2 years after first arriving at Sage Creek Ranch, I woke before dawn, as always, and walked out to the high pasture, the same place my grandfather had stood when he was wrestling with his regrets about my mother. I watched the sun rise over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold, and I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. I had found my place in the world. I had connected with a family history that gave my life context and meaning. I had learned that I was capable of far more than I had ever imagined, that strength comes not from never being afraid, but from doing difficult things despite the fear. I thought about my mother, who I barely remembered but who I felt I knew better now, through her journals and her room, and the stories people told about her. I thought about my grandfather, who had given me this incredible gift, not because I deserved it, but because he loved me, even though we never met. And I thought about the 7-year-old girl I had been standing in that orphanage office, being told she had no family, no connections, no foundation to build on. If I could go back and tell her what was waiting for her, tell her that someday she would stand on 300 acres of Montana rangeland that belonged to her and feel completely at home, I do not think she would believe me, but she would want to. She would hold on to that hope like a lifeline. As I walked back to the ranch house that morning, I made myself a promise. I would not make my grandfather's mistakes. I would not let pride or stubbornness keep me from the people I loved. I would maintain my connections with Mrs. Henderson, with the friends I had made in the ranching community, with Maria, who had become not just an employee, but a genuine friend. I would build a life that honored the past while remaining open to the future, whatever that might bring. And someday, if I was blessed enough to have children of my own, I would tell them the story of Sage Creek Ranch, of the grandfather they never met who loved them before they were born, and of the importance of family, forgiveness, and having the courage to claim the life you are meant to live. So, if you have stayed with me through this entire journey, if you have listened to this story from beginning to end, I want to ask you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel, because I will continue to share stories from Sage Creek Ranch, the challenges and triumphs of building a life on this land. But more than that, I want to hear your stories. Have you ever received an unexpected gift that changed the direction of your life? Have you ever discovered that you were stronger and more capable than you believed? Have you ever had to choose between fear and possibility, between staying safe and taking a leap into the unknown? Share your story in the comments below, because we are building a community here of people who believe in second chances, in the power of perseverance, and in the extraordinary things that can happen when you are brave enough to claim your inheritance, whatever form that inheritance might take. And here is my final question for you. What did you learn from this story? What will you carry with you into your own life? For me, I learned that family is not just about blood, that home is something you build rather than something you are born into, and that it is never too late to start over, to claim your place in the world, to become the person you are meant to be. I learned that grief and joy can coexist, that loss and discovery are often intertwined, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. I learned that I am stronger than I ever imagined, and that strength is not about never falling, but about getting back up every single time. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. Thank you for listening to my story. And whatever you are facing in your own life right now, whatever challenges or opportunities or uncertainties, I hope this story reminds you that you are capable of more than you know. You have the strength to face whatever comes next. And you are never truly alone, even when it feels that way, because there are people out there rooting for you, believing in you, waiting to see what extraordinary things you will accomplish when you finally give yourself permission to try.